Good morning. Chris Mark here with a sniper's perspective on a beautiful April 15th, 2024. Bringing you, again, updates in politics and various current events and anything else I feel like talking about today. We've got some guests lined up in the next week or two, so hopefully you'll stick around for that. So today we're going to talk about something specifically, the Goldwater rule in the current environment. And for those that are unfamiliar with it, it's probably worth listening to because it's going to be fairly insightful. A little bit academic, I apologize, but it is very insightful given the current events and especially with the sitting president. But before we get into those gripping conversations, let me give a couple of shout outs. I missed it yesterday. I was trying to set up a new part of my studio. But yesterday, April 14th, 1911 marked when John Moses Browning, the American hero and firearms inventor from Utah, patented the first semi-automatic pistol, the venerable 1911, chambered in the 45 ACP, which ACP means automatic caliber pistol. And he's also responsible for the 25 ACP, the 32 ACP, but the 1911 is still used today in the U.S. military, and certainly a number of Second Amendment supporters have them. I have one. Love it. 100 and some odd years later, it is still great. So Mr. Browning is also responsible for the 50 BMG, the Ma Deuce, that's still used in the military today, that was designed in, gosh, I think it came out in about 1918, right at the end of World War I. The 30 caliber machine gun, the Winchester 1887 lever action, which was patented in 1887. I have one of those. Obviously, it's a clone, not a real one from 1887. I'm not that wealthy. The 1897 12-gauge shotgun, which was euphemistically in World War I called the trench gun. So folks would use it to clear German trenches. Of course, the Browning 9mm high power, and the list goes on and on. So, Mr. John Browning, a little bit of history on that. And then I missed yesterday giving the shout out to the deadliest sniper in U.S. history until Chris Kyle, as we all know with the American Sniper movie. On April 12th, 2024, we lost Marine Chuck Mulvaney. Now, by all accounts, he was just a fantastic guy. He was a family man. He was also a sniper in Vietnam and the deadliest sniper, as I said, until, American Sniper Chris Kyle came out. He was credited with 101 confirmed kills. He lived his life very quietly. Apparently, nobody knew the accounts of his time in Vietnam until some, investigative reporter dug up some military records. They found him. I believe he was a retired Forest Service officer at the time it came about, and he admitted it was him. And from that point on, for anybody involved in the sniper community or even the military, probably knew who he was, but he passed away. So I just want to give a big, rest easy, Marine. Certainly the pearly gates are a little safer, today than they were a few days ago with having Mr. Mulvaney there. So, God bless you and your family. And boy, an amazing, amazing human being. So back to the topic at hand, the Goldwater rule and why it's applicable. So before I get into too much about the current politics and the applicability of it right now, let's talk about the Goldwater rule and what it is. Now, I've got a couple of notes you'll see me looking at. I try not to do that. I try to speak extemporaneously, but there's a couple of things we want to make sure we don't miss in this podcast. So you will see me glancing over at notes. Look, anybody who has seen, President Biden bumble his way through interviews, argue with the press, for goodness sakes, they blame Trump for that, but look at Biden, insult Americans, very classic. If you remember, I don't work for you, talking to that union worker, and basically screw up everything he touches. And look, I'm an equal opportunity insulter, but I think we've gone so far into the surreal right now that this merits saying. It's hard pressed not to see the mental decline. In fact, one of my favorite satire sites, the Babylon Bee. If you've never read, go to the Babylon Bee. They're absolutely fantastic about satire. And they've got a post up that says, man found unfit to stand trial due to mental decline or something to that effect, but still found fit to run the country. So this is an interesting point and why the Goldwater rule comes in here. Remember that just a few days ago, Special Counsel Hur actually did not recommend President Biden for prosecution for storing highly classified documents for, in some cases, a decade or more in his garage, in various places where his son, who clearly is compromised, he's a drug addict. I mean, he's under being tried right now for felonies, where everybody has access to it. One of the reasons for not wanting to recommend him for prosecution was because of his mental decline. I mean, here's a man that literally said he could not remember the date of his son's death, did not recall when he was vice president, even asked a question as to whether or not he was still vice president. I mean, clearly this man is in mental decline. Now, it is important to note that while he did store classified documents in his garage, he was very clear to let the American people know that they were stored next to his 1964 Corvette. And so, at least we have that going for us, that it may have been in the garage, but it's next to the Corvette. So clearly nobody's going to touch him. So back to the Goldwater rule. So what is the Goldwater rule and why do we care about it? It was actually named after the 1964 presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater. And so what had happened is in 1964, there was a magazine that came out with an article, and it, asked whether or not Goldwater was able to be president. And they polled a bunch of psychiatrists as to his fitness, his mental fitness to be president. And they made some disparaging comments about Barry Goldwater. So he ended up suing the magazine and the editor, and he won. And at the time, 1964, he won $75,000 from the editor, a guy named Ginsburg. And so the American Psychological Association then came up with a rule. It's called the Goldwater Rule in Section 7 of the APA's Principle of Medical Ethics. So this is what it tells psychologists and psychiatrists they can and can't do, okay? It's an ethical canon. It says, and here's where I'm going to read some notes. It says, psychiatrists have a responsibility to participate in activities contributing to the improvement of the community and the betterment of public health. Makes perfect sense. It continues, and when they are asked to comment on public figures, they refrain from diagnosing, which requires a personal examination and consent. And again, it is named after former U.S. Senator and 64 Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater. Recall, Republican presidential nominee, 1964. This is going to come back again in this discussion. In the magazine, if you're curious, it was called Fact Magazine, and the article was called The Unconscious of a Conservative, a special issue on the mind of Barry Goldwater. And that was a spin on a book he had published about himself called The Unconscious of a Conservative. So language in section 7.3 of the Goldwater rule is what I had just quoted, 7.3. So why does this matter? Well, in my mind, and I'm sure in a lot of people's minds, it demonstrates yet again this double standard that people that lean more to the right, you can call them Republicans or whatever. I think fiscally, I'm certainly more conservative on some, social issues. I think I run more liberally, but let's just say Republican for sake of argument here, make it a binary Democrat or Republican. Well, very clearly, there's a double standard here. It applies to thee, but not to me. And we're going to talk a little bit about why this does. So if you remember, when Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, first he was met with, snickers and jeers and laughter. And there's a great YouTube video where they've got everybody from Obama to the women on The View to Tom Hanks, Nancy Pelosi, I believe, and I'm paraphrasing, she said, mark my word, he will never be president, never. And Tom Hanks came out and said something to the effect that Donald Trump will be president about the same time that an alien spaceship lands on Earth and dinosaurs get out of it. And then you had all these night show hosts that were making fun of him. And even Obama got on and did a mic drop where they were reading the mean tweets on the Late Late Show. And they pretended one was from Donald Trump. And he said, "You're the worst president ever." And Obama says something to the effect of, "Well, at least I can say I was president," drops the mic. So as he was running, he was met with jeers and cheers. And then when he won the nomination, you started seeing the left really start getting frenetic and frantic about their activities. If you recall, and again, you can find this on YouTube, there was a video that was put on by Martin Sheen was the spokesperson in the video. And again, he played in that television shows. I never watched it about the White House and the presidency. So you had Martin Sheen, you had the woman from Will and Grace. I don't remember her name. You had a bunch of these actors, and Martin Sheen was saying, to be president, the qualifications are you're eminently qualified. And they went through this whole thing. And then at the end, they had a disclaimer. We're not saying you should vote for Hillary. All we're saying is you shouldn't vote for Trump, right? It was absolutely just ludicrous that they would do that. Eminently qualified. They made a big stink about it. Well, fast forward, and guess what happens? Hillary Clinton loses to Donald Trump. So now this thing goes into overdrive. And anybody that doesn't believe me, the Goldwater rule and the way that was put out there is a clear example. So Donald Trump was sworn into office on January 20th, 2017. Okay. So I'm going to walk through a couple of dates here because I think they are important. Less than 4 months later, there were calls to remove him under what's called the 25th Amendment of the Constitution. The amendment basically says that if a vice president and a majority of the executives in the various departments, right, in government say, we believe that the president is unable to perform his duties or her duties for any number of reasons. It's intentionally vague, but clearly being physically incapacitated, being psychologically or mentally incapacitated. If the vice president and a majority of the executives from the various departments believe that's the case, they can go to the Speaker of the House, and then they can remove the president from power and put the vice president in power. And at the time, it was Mike Pence. So in May, you were having calls for this because people just in 4 months were like, well, gosh, we don't like Trump. And so it really is interesting. And in May 2017, the New York Times wrote an article speaking of removing Trump under the 25th Amendment. And now here's where it really gets kind of curious and interesting. So that same month, there's a Yale-trained psychiatrist named Lee, Dr. Lee. I think her name was like Nancy Lee, or let me see if I can find her name here. Well, we'll just call her Dr. Lee for the sake of this. I know her last name was Lee. So the same month, she was quoted in an article titled, Yale psychiatrist says Trump has a grave blank disability. And Dr. Lee was quoted in that. And again, the timing of this is very interesting. So in January of 2017, you had Trump elected. By May, you already had calls for his removal under this 25th Amendment, which said that he's just not capable of doing that. So we move on from May. Let's see if I can get my thing to fast forward here. In the introduction of the article itself says, and this is a direct quote, psychiatrists in the United States are blocked from commenting on the psychological wellness of politicians due to the 50-year-old Goldwater rule, which states that they cannot openly diagnose the mental health of public figures who have not been personally examined. So again, if you're a public figure, a doctor from afar cannot say, well, he's showing signs, he's clearly schizophrenic or whatever the case is. But they got by that by saying, well, wait a second, Dr. Lee wasn't diagnosing him. She was just speaking out like any American citizen, good, red-blooded American citizen should do, because she's so concerned about her country. And again, here's where it gets interesting. The case of Donald Trump is so extreme and potentially consequential that some noted psychiatrists have felt compelled to speak out despite the rule, is what they said. So, okay, we understand there's a rule that we shouldn't say, but gosh, Donald Trump is so bad for our country that we're going to violate our canons of ethics and speak out anyway. And then you've got Dr. Lee, showing just absolute arrogance and entitlement, Yale-trained psychiatrist. And then Donald Trump's been in office 4 whole months. And she comes out, and this is a direct quote from Dr. Lee. This situation, I guess the 4 months of Donald Trump being in office, has come to such a critical level. In fact, a state of emergency exists, and we could no longer hold back. We have an obligation to speak about Donald Trump's mental health issues because many lives and our survival as a species may be at stake. Our very survival as a species. Can you imagine that? You've got one doctor that basically is saying our very survival could be at stake. Therefore, damn the torpedoes, to hell with the rules. I'm going to say whatever I want because Donald Trump is such an imminent threat and we're a state of emergency. Now, it's important to remember, this was all in May of 2017. Donald Trump had only been in office 4 months. Now let's fast forward. So the clock ticks. And now we're into December 5th of 2017. Congress decides to hold a hearing. And who do they invite to speak in front of the members of Congress? Now, they claim it's a bipartisan group of Congress people. But let's be honest. I mean, how many Republicans were there? I mean, it was held by the Democrats at the time. I'm sure they had a token. It was probably what's her name from Wyoming. Liz Cheney was the token Republican there who hated Trump anyways. But either way, December 5th and 6th, they invited Dr. Lee to speak to the members of Congress about this. Now, of course, after she's done talking, you're going to have an interview. And of course, CNN, of all people, is going to interview her. And CNN asked Dr. Lee what she thought. And here was, again, a direct quote from Dr. Lee. Lawmakers were saying that they've been very concerned about this. The president's dangerousness, the dangers that his mental instability poses on the nation. They know the concern is universal among Democrats, but it really depends on Republicans, they said. Some of the Republicans they knew were concerned, maybe equally concerned, but whether they would act on those concerns was their worry. Oh my gosh. I mean, of course, all Democrats were worried about, President Trump's mental health, but not bumbling Joe Biden, who is talking about meeting, the G7 conference with the Prime Minister of Germany, who's been dead since 2017, or the Prime Minister of France, who's been dead since 2006. I mean, here's a man that can't remember when his son died, bumbles over every word he makes, but that's okay in today's world. But President Trump, he says rough language and, he's probably not as polished. He didn't come from politics, but we just don't like him. So you know what? He's mentally unstable. Again, the argument on the left for Dr. Lee was, well, she wasn't making a diagnosis, for goodness sakes. All she was doing was what any good red-blooded American would do, is she was simply speaking on behalf of us and protecting us, and you can see by the look on my face, making a joke about this. But anybody with half a brain that watches, President Biden today, first of all, I'll be as direct as I can. I think his wife should be ashamed. I mean, there's a point when, in my mind, it becomes elder abuse. You put somebody in a situation where they truly do not have the cognitive ability and they don't recognize it. And that's the hard part. They don't recognize it. And you keep putting him out there as a show pony. It's very clear. He won't take, questions shouted from the press. When he does, it turns into an absolute debacle, like this last time he did it. All of his interviews are softball interviews with very left-leaning liberal people. When they do call on members of the press, they've got a pre-selected list of people they're going to call on that they know are going to be friendly. God forbid they call him Ducey. Now, Biden, I guess getting his feelings hurt that he was told he had mental decline or cognitive decline, decided he was going to hold a press conference. He did. He did call on Peter Ducey. And again, it was a train wreck. He said, well, Mr. President, how is your memory, or something to that effect? And Biden said, well, obviously, it's not so good because I called on you. I mean, we've got a president here that is so combative. And for anybody who's lived around cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, things like that, which I have seen it, firsthand, that oftentimes manifests itself in kind of that outward aggression and anger towards people. He doesn't have the ability to act with compunction. People say, well, Donald Trump, I mean, for goodness sakes, Biden was just caught calling Netanyahu an asshole 3 times. I mean, this guy is so vulgar and so offensive behind the scenes, but again, he's being protected. So when we look at this double standard in our country, you simply can't ignore it. You've got Donald Trump coming into office immediately. 25th Amendment, we got to get rid of him. You got Biden being propped up, and now they're talking about him running for a second term. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine him in a debate with Donald Trump? It will be an absolute bloodbath, but they're not going to let him debate. They don't let him debate anybody. But again, this whole blog post on this part was intended to do nothing more than really show that double standard that does exist in our country. And it extends for a lot of things. I mean, if you just look at the comparison between how former President Trump is being treated compared to Biden, both had the same issue, right? Both of them were caught with classified documents. I used to have security clearance. I know how this works. Intent has nothing to do with it. Everybody that has access to classified documents, especially highly classified stuff, understands you can't take it home. You can't hide it. You got to disclose it. You got to turn it over. You got to do this. You got to do that. So, okay, Trump gets caught. Biden gets caught. Trump has 38 felony charges, 38 put on him. Biden, basically, they say, well, he's just a senile old man. We're not going to do anything. It doesn't matter. That's like me going out and committing a horrible crime and them saying, well, Chris is, he's mentally, he's not all there. We'll just let him go. Now, certainly there are exceptions, and people do get off of horrible crimes if they are mentally incompetent to the point they can't stand trial. So is that what the special counsel is saying is, hey, this guy is so mentally incompetent, we can't hold him accountable, but hey, it's okay if he runs the country. Now, on the flip side, you've got Donald Trump with 38 felonies, facing him for this. I mean, it's just a complete, double standards, completely arbitrary. You've got Antifa that would burn down police stations, abuse people, hurt people, whatever. Hey, that's okay. You got people that go up to the Capitol building are getting, 15 years in prison. 15 years in prison. So just a double standard. I was reading this morning, another really interesting thing came out in the news. And my last blog post, I believe we talked about the democratization of the U.S. and how the U.S. is actually a democracy and a representative democracy. And within the U.S., we've got kind of an interesting model in that the House of Representatives, our representatives, are they're actually elected based on the populations of the state. So I believe, doing this from memory, the last time that they reallocated representatives, I believe California lost a couple, and I think New York may have lost a couple because the populations had declined so much from people moving out of those states. And how do they know how many people are there? Well, they do these census type counts, and they figure out and they say, okay, here's how many people are in the state. Therefore, we're going to allocate X amount of representatives because the representatives should represent the population and, represent their constituents, which are the population. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Any kind of census counts are subject to a lot of variability. I mean, they try to tease it out, but it's very difficult because there's certain things you can't ask. So if I go to a door and, I say, hey, how many people are in the household? You could say 1, you could say 500. I have no way of going in there and technically telling. The other thing is you can't go in and ask somebody if they're in the United States illegally. Well, I guess they could ask them, but they don't have to answer it. It's not a requirement. So we're dealing with a lot of kind of challenges to figure out, well, how many people are actually here? Well, they just had a study that came out, and you can find this on Fox News this morning. I think it was one of the major headlines. And they said that due to the illegal immigration that we've got now, particularly under the Biden administration, this can cause such a profound change in the population that it could increase the number of representatives in the House of Representatives by 22. So last count, I believe there are about 469 representatives in the House. But think about that. This could add 22 more Congress people to the House of Representatives due to illegal immigration. Now, this, I think, and I've spoken on this before and I've written on this. And by the way, the article I just wrote or spoke about the Goldwater rule and all that, you can actually look at my blog. Again, it's always over me, globalriskinfo.com. Look up Goldwater rule. I wrote about this in 2018. But, I've said this numerous times in the past. I think the Democrats, the reason they don't want to close the border is exactly this. They want an influx of illegal immigrants. They know it's going to increase the count of representatives. And their hope, I believe, was that, well, once these people get naturalized, or, their kids, they have kids, those kids become, American citizens by being born here, whatever, Hispanics typically would lean left and vote Democrat. So it adds their voting block. Well, unfortunately, what they're finding out now is, Latinos, well, they may generally vote left. They also, very, very large percentage of them are Catholic, and they are very, very concerned about the support of abortion on the left. So when you start hearing, these Latino people being interviewed, you'll hear a lot of them that'll say, hey, I'm not going to vote Democrat this time because of their position on abortion. And this goes back to what I talked about in satisficing. I think on my first blog post about this, which is, most people are not single issue voters, but there are things that are more important to them than other things. And, the whole argument about abortion has come to the forefront so strongly, and the sides are, the lines are being drawn. And the left has taken a very, very, very extreme position, in my opinion, on what should be allowed. The right, probably there's some extreme positions on there. my personal views, and I'll share them here because I think this is how most Americans think. For me, I think I would like to say, and I've always said, conceptually, I don't agree with abortion conceptually. But two things. One, I'm not a woman. So for me, it really is just a philosophical debate, right? I don't agree with this, but I don't have to live with it. And so for that reason, I believe that I am not in a position to dictate necessarily what a woman should do with their body. I believe in personal agency. I believe in privacy. Now, ... there's also another qualifier there. I do believe as rational human beings, whether or not I agree with it, and I'm willing to put my personal beliefs aside, there's a limit to that. When you've got people pushing for partial birth abortions, no limits on the times, things like that. I mean, that's where I draw the line. I say I simply cannot agree with this. So again, this is how a lot of people kind of vote, is they say, well, how do I view this, and what's really important, and what's more important to me? And again, as they start looking and they're interviewing, the Latino population, they're finding that a lot of them are saying, hey, we're not going to vote for you. We're going to the right because we feel so strongly about families and abortion rights that everything else is going to take a back seat to us because they tend to be very Catholic. They're also seeing this, believe it or not, the Democrats are losing a lot of the African-American votes. And it's kind of interesting when you, again, start seeing these interviews. I saw a fascinating one. They were interviewing people in Chicago. And what was coming up over and over again is, wait a second, Chicago is giving, free handouts to these illegal immigrants. I've lived in Southside Chicago for 40 years. Unemployment's out of control, crime's out of control. We get nothing from the city, but you come over here illegally, they give you a place to sleep, place to live, they give you a phone, they give you everything. So that's bothering them. And then I heard somebody that had a really interesting statement, and he was like, I was a Democrat, I voted for Biden. He goes, but I'm not going to. We're tired of being lied to. And he said, at least with Trump, you know what you're getting. It's easier to deal with somebody if they're a jerk consistently, and they're going to be a jerk and they're predictable, than somebody like this. So, we'll see where all this goes. What's frustrating to me is I think we're going to see more of these antics come up. I mean, this whole charade of a lawsuit in New York City. They use some obscure administrative law to go after President Trump's business dealings. There's no burden of proof that has to be presented. It's not a trial by jury. The judge had already found him guilty. I mean, it's an administrative law. Trump had banks that came in and said, we didn't lose any money. He paid everything. And I've been through acquisitions, I've sold companies, things like that. So when you give your financials, you have your financials put together, you give them to somebody else. And then that side, you always give the disclaimer, hey, do your own due diligence on this, right? Do your own due diligence. You're buying this, so do your due diligence. And you've done that. Nobody said they ever lost money or anything else yet under some obscure administrative law that doesn't allow a trial by jury. He's already been found, liable for, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, whatever it is. And anybody with half a brain can see this is a charade. Is he a likable guy? Probably not. Do a lot of people like him? Obviously not. Do a lot of people like me? Probably not. I'm pretty darn outspoken. I can be aggressive. So you know what? That's the reason I'm not president. Is that in and of itself enough to remove, the laws of the people and the voice of the people? Absolutely not. And since I'm on kind of this, rant, as I like to do, as I want to do, I just saw the other day that the state of Hawaii is now saying that the constitutional right for the Second Amendment does not apply in Hawaii. And the rationale for this is really, in my mind, bizarre. So the state of Hawaii has a constitution. They have an amendment that mirrors basically the U.S. Constitution. But they have restricted gun rights significantly. And their rationale was the spirit of aloha. I'm doing this in air quotes because to me it was so bizarre. The spirit of aloha trumps your constitutional right. Now, what is the spirit of aloha? I had to look this up. So, the governor or whomever it was said, well, the spirit of aloha basically means we have a history of living in peace and aloha, guns are not culturally a part of our blah, blah. So the spirit of aloha needs to take precedence over your constitutionally guaranteed inalienable rights. Once again, I think when that gets to the Supreme Court, I think it's a matter of time. It will. I think the Supreme Court's going to, shoot it down 6 ways to Sunday. But it just shows some of the bizarre things we're seeing. And now, the left is so terrified about Trump being elected to office, quite frankly. I mean, it's by hook or by crook. They're just trying to keep him off the ballot, which really bothers me. You've got states, I think Colorado's one, a bunch of them that have said, well, he's ineligible to be on the ballot, and the Supreme Court is hearing those, and I think they've been shooting him down. But again, let the will of the people and the voice of the people speak, but trying to win by hook or by crook, that's really dirty politics, and that's where we are. So that's kind of my rant today. But it is interesting, the Goldwater rule, especially in light of something that is so obvious to so many people. I mean, President Biden is in serious cognitive decline. Ronnie Jackson, who I believe is a representative now, but he was the staff physician, the White House physician, doctor, under Obama and I believe under Trump, and he ran for Congress. He had seen Biden every day for 8 years. 8 years. He came out 2 days ago and said, look, I know this man. I watched him every single day for 8 years. And this is not the same man that he was 8 years ago. He was in serious cognitive decline. That man's saying that. But again, the silence on the left is deafening. Nobody will say anything. And everybody's like, oh, no. Anybody, KJP said, anybody that, is around Biden comes out feeling the same way. Man, that guy's, he's sharp as a rock or whatever. Yeah, dumb as a rock, sharp as a rock. But it's interesting how different both sides are treated. So with that being said, you can always read my rantings, globalriskinfo.com. Send me questions, comments. Willing to talk about anything, not shy of doing research to educate myself a little bit more. Appreciate everybody listening. We're going to have some live podcasts coming up with some guests. We're going to talk about some interesting topics. I've got a very, very good sniper I've known for a long time that's going to get on and talk about sniper issues. I would like to recommend, you're going to hear more about this. I'm a disabled vet, and I fought, like many veterans, I fought for years for my disability rating and then to get it upgraded. Yeah, I mean, it's a years-long process, and the VA certainly is not friendly to people trying to dispute their VA rating. So I was looking around about 2.5 years ago now, for a company that could help me with this, navigate this. And most of the companies I found would say, hey, we'll help you, but we're going to get a percentage of your rating for the rest of your life. And I started calculating this. I'm like, wow, this is going to end up costing me $30,000 or $40,000. I'm not going to do that. Well, I ran across a company called, and look down below, the360veteran.com, the360veteran.com. Put the in front of it, 360 the number, veteran.com. And I spoke to a gentleman over there. His name is Stephen Crane, and it's his company. And hey, let me just, to be on the up and up, I don't have a dog in this fight. I don't make a dime from it. I get no kickbacks. I don't do anything. I'm doing this to help veterans. The360veteran.com. So I called up Stephen. He spent probably an hour on the phone with me, explained how they work. And he said, what are your disabilities? I explained it to him. And he said, well, the shoulder being destroyed, the VA is not going to increase that because they just do range of motion and they say, hey, this is all you get. And I said, okay, fine. Some of the other things, TBI, stuff like that, a little more pronounced. So he said, we can do it. He charged me a flat fee. I don't know what his flat fee now is, but it was less than $2,000 when I did it. And my thought was, hey, I've got a lot of friends that have gone through and have, some serious issues from combat, things like that are fighting with the VA. So if this works, it'd be great. I can recommend it. If it doesn't work, a couple grand out of my pocket, lesson learned. So went ahead, signed up with them, put me through the process 3 weeks later. And I'm not saying this is probably an outlier. 3 weeks later, I got my full rating back. And 3 weeks. So I recommended him to a lot of my military buddies, and he's helped a lot of them. The other thing about Steven and his company is they're not going to BS. If you call him up and you say, hey, I want to fight for my disability increase. And he says, well, what is your disability? And you say, well, I've got turf toe from playing flag football. He'll tell you, here's how the VA rates that. And then he'll say, I'm happy to take your money and fight for you, but The most you're going to get for turf toe is going to be whatever, 20% or whatever the case is. And they've got very specific ratings. So Stephen is a former Marine Corps officer, so he understands. He's been through the process himself, and he's helped a lot of my friends. So with that being said, if you're looking for help with your VA rating, definitely check out the360veteran.com, the360veteran.com. The gentleman's name is Stephen Crane. Really, really good guy, but hopefully that helps. So appreciate everybody listening, and you will hear me come back in a day or so. Thanks so much.